All right, this is the Witcher 3 Next Gen update, and you guys don't need to hear about all my troubles trying to get my stats counter in the top left corner to actually work. But anyway, it's working now. And this is the RTX 4090, and we're running at 4K. Everything's maxed out. And are you guys watching the frame time graph in the top left corner? Because it's a little bit stuttery. Now currently, I'm not using any DLSS or any DLSS frame generation because I wanted to just kind of get an idea of, how does the game work at the native resolution and all that. So here's an idea. Basically, we're running around. I just loaded up my save from when I beat the game. I think this is one of the expansions or whatever. Been a while, guys, but we can overall see that I seem to be hovering in kind of the mid 40 FPS range, maxed out at 4K on the RTX 4090. We saw in my camera swing here, look at the frame time graph. Did you guys see all those stutters? So I will say things do feel a bit stuttery. Now the rest of the system, if you want to blame that, well, I'm on a Ryzen 7 7700X CPU with 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000 CL36 RAM, so everything's pretty good, and apparently it's going to tell me about my garden. Now, we should probably look around at the graphics settings and talk about that a little bit. So first of all, let's confirm what I told you is true. First of all, I guess we'll show that yes, this is 4K, and currently frame generation is turned off. Low latency is on though. And then we have the graphics settings. I've gone over to the RT Ultra preset basically. So this turns everything on. We've got the ray trace reflections, shadows, ambient occlusion, and global illumination. Anti-aliasing is currently, I set it to TAAU because I didn't want to have DLSS on yet, so you could look at the native performance. And then dynamic resolution scaling is turned off to keep that at the native stuff. Now I do have motion blur and whatnot. I just left all these things on. I know some of you guys are gonna be like, you have motion blur on, turn that off. You know what, screw you. Anyway, I do have everything on, including all the hair works and ultra plusseting. So by the way, this game did not just get a ray tracing update. There's a lot of other updates. We have ultra plus settings, which now increase the number of background characters, shadow quality, terrain quality, water quality, foliage visibility range, grass density, texture quality, detail level. All of that now has an ultra plus setting. And they've incorporated a whole bunch of user created mods into the game for like higher resolution texture packs and monsters and all of that. So it's all good stuff. Anyway, let's kick on. By the way, we have FSR2 as well as DLSS, but we are on an NVIDIA GPU here, so we might as well use DLSS. Let's kick it onto the quality setting, and now let's see what happens to our frame rate. So I'm gonna reset my average frame rate counter. You can see the average in the middle, the current frame rate on the left, and the 1% lows on the right. So just kicking on some DLSS quality, and actually, things feel pretty good now. We're over 60 FPS, and I don't see any major problems with the image quality using DLSS quality. Generally, DLSS quality at 4K does look quite good for those of you watching at home. You know what? You will, if you're not on a 4K screen, you may have to take my word for it, and YouTube kind of kills a lot of detail anyway. Now, one thing I'll say is I feel like the LOD changes. So like, do you see how this tree pops in and out of existence as I go forward and backward? I wish we could have got those LOD ranges increased, because I also noticed with all the shadowing on the tree, the self-shadowing from the ray-traced shadows, it's just, I don't know, it's just really noticeable that that tree pops in and out there. I don't know, guys, not a huge fan of that. I think we should also get to some water and take a look at that, but to see the ray traced reflections. But while we're running around, I think it would also make sense for us to talk about DLSS frame generation. Now, obviously, currently only the RTX 4090 and 4080 can take advantage of this feature, but we are testing out the RTX 4080 at the moment. So this game was updated with DLSS frame generation. If we go to the video settings and display settings, that's where they've put it, and we can kick on DLSS frame generation. Let's go ahead and do that. So kicking DLSS frame generation on, it's going to take a second to kick in. Give it a second for the frame rates and everything to smooth out. I'm gonna go ahead and hit the reset on our average frame rate counter and our 1% lows. Now, notice our frame rate is now over 100 frames per second. Now, what DLSS 3 does, for those of you who don't know, is it basically holds back a frame that the game has already produced and then takes your frame plus that frame and inserts an artificially generated frame in between that looks pretty close to what it should look like, although oftentimes there are issues with the image quality. However, if you're running at a high enough frame rate, those issues tend to be fairly hard to notice. Now, this does slightly increase latency, so this is not a good thing in a multiplayer game. In a competitive game, I guess, like a fast-paced first-person shooter. But in a game like this, guys, this game's best played on a controller. I'm using a controller right now. I cannot perceive any increase to the input latency on my controller right now. Also, I'm kind of looking around and I'm not seeing any real obvious problems with the image quality. I like this in a lot of the single-player games I've tested it in. I didn't like it in Spider-Man because I've noticed that he goes so fast around various buildings and things with the webs shooting out all over the place that I didn't like the image quality in Spider-Man. But other than not using it in multiplayer games and single-player games, Spider-Man specifically, I'm actually really liking DLSS 3 frame generation. It's really smoothing out, like as I pan the camera around on my 120 hertz display, it is noticeably smoother, and I definitely prefer frame generation on to off from what I've tested out in this game. But now let's talk about the ray tracing. Okay, yes, there's better reflections on the water right now, but do you guys see that weird line in the water right now? Doesn't that look weird as I move forward here? I've got to say, I don't think that looks very good. So why don't we do a little bit of ray tracing on versus off comparisons? Because remember, this game was really not designed with ray tracing in mind on all of this. So let's do a little bit of ray trace reflections off. I'm leaving all the other ray tracing on. So ray trace reflections off. And by the way, they did also increase the screen space reflection quality in this game. Now with screen space reflections, you see the issue is that as I pan my camera up and down, you can see that things only get reflected in the water if they are on my screen above the water. So as more things come into view, like the trees and the bridge and the rocks, you can see they become reflected in the water as they become visible on the screen. Now, so that's a little bit weird. So you get that image quality artifact, but I don't see quite as weird of a line thing going on as we saw with the ray traced reflections on. So I think this is a bit of a hit and a miss with the ray traced reflections. It seems to have some pros and cons to it. So again, here's the ray traced reflections on. Now when I pan the camera up and down, there is less of that screen space issue, but do you guys see that weird line in the water, right? Like at this angle, things look great. And then here we see that weird line in the water. I don't know what to make of it exactly, guys. Looking this way, I think things look pretty good. So looking this way, maybe I just found a strange body of water to test the reflections on, and maybe that's gonna be atypical. I obviously have not had a chance to like beat the entire game with the new update in the last 10 minutes, you know? Here's with the ray trace reflections off on this water in this direction. Here I feel like it's, you know, less meaningful either way. All right, why don't we go ahead though and look at some other ray tracing effects on versus off. So back to the ray traced settings. Let's go ahead and kick everything on. So once again, here is everything on. Now let's take a look at all the ray tracing turned off. And also just remember that the ray tracing is not the only thing added to this. We also have the Ultra Plus settings to look at. Okay, ray tracing, all of that, everything is off. You guys see differences to the shadows? Like, look at the grass and things like that. So the grass right now doesn't seem to cast any sorts of shadows on itself. So let's find another scene to look at here. Maybe get away from the water for a second. Let's look at more trees and grass and everything in this scene here. You can also look at just the general lighting quality, all of that. And let's take a look at this scene and try the ray tracing on versus off treatment. So all the ray tracing coming back on here. And, well, I think that you can see a little more self-shadowing to the grasses and the trees and everything like that. So, I mean, I think it's cool to have this update. And like I said, there's been lots of other things added in here as well, including the Ultra Plus settings. So another thing that we could look at isn't ray tracing on versus off. We could actually look at the game with the ray tracing off. So here's another ray tracing on versus off. So, okay, ray tracing off. I think the lighting and shadows do look worse with it off. So, I mean, cool. Good update. Now let's go ahead and play with the graphics settings a little bit more, because without this update, we would not have had the Ultra Plus settings, right? So if we go ahead and pull all of these back, right? So we're gonna go down to Ultra, which is where the game used to max out. Let's see if we notice any particular differences. I mean, I don't know, guys. I can probably put a side-by-side up for you, but yeah. Anyway, there's more quality available on things now, which is a good thing. Okay, actually, just a second. Look in the distance there. That seems weird. Do you see that building flickering in and out of existence in the distance? I'm curious if that still happens with the Ultra Plus settings. Like, is that a bug, or is that a difference on the Ultra Plus? Like, are we gonna get more? Obviously, by the way, you wouldn't see the number of background characters being different unless you're in a place where that's actually going to matter, right? Anyway, trying going to these settings. I'm curious if we give it a second to load in, if we'll see more of that building in the distance. I'm gonna reset the frame rate counter here. Okay, still feels kind of unstable. All right, that didn't solve that. Well, all right, guys. I think looking at some interior scenes might make sense. Here we go. All right, we are inside. Okay, I think inside, so we can see a lot of the red lighting on Geralt's face. We can see a lot going on with the lighting here. So I have a feeling that if we turn off all the ray tracing here, we will probably see a noticeable difference with the ray tracing off. Let's go ahead and do that. Yeah, there's definitely a marked difference to the lighting in this room right now with RT off. So let's go ahead, and I think I want to take a look at another direction here. So let's find another spot to look at. We've got our buddy over here. Why don't we Look at this. We got a couple character models on the screen, all of that. And now let's get the ray tracing into the image. So video settings, graphics, RT on. I think it is noticeably better. So overall, I think it's a cool update. I think that the RTX 4090 seems to be handling itself well here. Although, like I said, when I was running at the native resolution, no DLSS, no frame generation, any of that, we were getting some stutters on the frame time graph, and they were kind of noticeable. I think that with frame generation and DLSS quality on, I think we're doing pretty smooth. There's a little spike right there. So what I'm trying to do right now is run out to areas I haven't loaded in yet, just in case this has anything to do with shader compilation or anything like that. See if we get any last little bits of stutters or anything. It was also swinging the camera around. Yeah, there was definitely a noticeable stutter. So there are absolutely noticeable stutters happening. Look at the frame time graph, guys. There's even with DLSS and frame generation on, can confirm still getting stutters. So that's a little bit frustrating. That seems to be the major downside that I can see so far. Yeah, some stutters there again. Last thing I think I'll test out is, okay, in a demanding area like this, let's just check how far could we push the frame rate if we were willing to DLSS a little bit harder. Okay, let's try out DLSS balanced. Give it a second to load up. I'm gonna reset the frame rate counter and all that. So in this scene, DLSS balanced, again with frame generation activated, we're now pushing near my 120 FPS, monitor limit. And then we can test out once again. Why don't we kick on DLSS to the performance mode. So DLSS performance, resetting my frame rate there. So DLSS performance with frame generation on. In this scene, which I did just use because it seemed more demanding than some of the others, we are over 120 frames per second at 4K. However, we can also look at what if we weren't using frame generation. So if I try DLSS performance with frame generation off, it looks like DLSS performance has me around 60 FPS here. Although notice I think I'm CPU limited right now. Look at my GPU utilization. So the GPU utilization is at about 74%. A lot of times ray tracing adds to the CPU workload. So I think what we're seeing right now is a CPU limited situation. In other words, I think that if I make DLSS less aggressive right now, without using frame generation, like let's go to DLSS quality. Notice that the performance here is the same as it was at DLSS performance mode. And notice the GPU, while its utilization is up to 90%, it's still not being fully utilized. So this is an example of where frame generation really shines, because DLSS frame generation, because it's not actually having the game engine create new frames, it's just adding in really fake frames. They're not generated by the game engine. It doesn't rely on the CPU to participate. So by kicking on frame generation here, we are almost doubling the frame rate because, like I said, it's holding back a frame and it's adding in a fake one in between. So you have a fake frame, if we want to call it that, in between every real frame, but that does increase the frame rate. Now, I do think the last thing I should mention here is it's important to note that this is not the same thing as increasing performance. The game is not rendering any quicker, but your image quality will be smoother. When I pan my camera right now, everything feels incredibly smooth and responsive on my 120 hertz display. Whereas if I kick frame generation off right now, and pan the cam around. You guys are on a 60 FPS video, so you probably can't see the difference as well as I do, but is much less smooth. Much less smooth there with the frame generation off. So once again, I've got to say, look, we're CPU limited here. I can't stay over 60 FPS. It's a Ryzen 7 7700X, guys. It's a good CPU. And frame generation really does smooth some of that out. So I'm actually very, very pleased with frame generation here. But this does mean that if I test out some other GPUs, let me know if you guys are interested. I have a feeling that if we look at NVIDIA's 3000 series and AMD's GPUs, we might have some trouble keeping the ray tracing at high frame rates just due to the CPU limits, not even the GPU limits. So interesting stuff. I think the last thing I'll want to experiment with here is if we're CPU limited, like I said, I think the culprit is probably ray tracing. So what if we don't use the frame generation? Okay, so like I said, without frame generation, we become CPU limited. We're at about 92%. And then if I, let's emphasize that actually. So like I said, let's kick DLSS on really aggressively here. So we are definitely CPU limited, right? The GPU is only able to be utilized 75% because the CPU doesn't seem to be able to keep up here. Now, if we turn ray tracing off, I think that we will no longer be quite so CPU bottlenecked. So let's go ahead and play with that a little bit. So ray tracing off. And I am still CPU limited. That was intentional. That's why I went to DLSS performance, right? I'm still CPU limited, but that CPU limit is now almost 100 frames per second in the same scene. Do you guys see what I'm saying here? So in this same scene, I'm CPU limited either way with DLSS performance, but I'm CPU limited at a much lower frame rate when we use ray tracing. That's what I'm trying to say. With ray tracing on, I'm CPU limited at about 60 frames per second here. And there's nothing I can do about that other than get a better CPU, although, you know, I guess we'll have to wait for them to make new CPUs. In some situations, the 13900K is faster, but not by much. All right, FrameGen on, and everything smooths out. So I've got to say, this is definitely one where I think DLSS frame generation is putting up a good show. I'm not noticing any significant artifacts that would bug me while playing. I'm sure if I slow down the footage frame by frame, I would find some weirdness. Probably most likely as Geralt's hands kind of pass by things as he runs his. But guys, honestly, as I was playing the game, I was just looking ahead. I wasn't looking at his feet. So anyway, these technologies are not perfect. There are trade-offs to image quality. Let's go back to like TAAU or something like that with FrameGen off, and we can now sprint. I think it's more stable, but the image is certainly more choppy just due to, guys, I'm at 30 frames per second right now, okay? Wow. I'm also CPU limited, or I don't know, guys, my GPU is only at 80% utilization right now. That's interesting. All right, think we'll end the video here. If you'd like to see me test out some other GPUs, let me know. I hope all of you have an excellent day.